Maybe you've been wondering lately if the grass is maybe greener on the other side. What I mean by that is maybe you've been dissatisfied with Catholicism lately and you're discerning Orthodoxy, for example. In that case, I have the perfect book for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy, a Catholic Response to Attacks from the East by Michael Lofton. It was published a couple of weeks ago, and in the book, Mr. Lofton answers the most common objections against Catholicism from the Orthodox. In this video, I will first summarize some of the chapters which I found particularly interesting, and at the end I will also give you my opinion on the book. The chapters I chose to summarize all have something to do with the papacy in some sense, so we'll talk about who the head of the church is, so is it Christ or the Pope, and I will talk about Orthodox objections against the concept of papal infallibility. But first, let's start with a brief introduction to the author. Mr. Michael Lofton is an Eastern Catholic who has a Catholic YouTube channel called Reason and Theology with currently around 70,000 subscribers. He's currently working on his doctorate in theology, and the topic of his dissertation is the Magisterium of the Catholic Church, which I find to be probably the most interesting theological topic in our day and age. So, Mr. Lofton, I know you'll be watching this. Maybe you'd like to send me your dissertation when it's done, because I would totally read it, and maybe I could even summarize some parts of it in a video. By the way, this video is not sponsored by Mr. Lofton, but I'm finally collaborating with Audible. So if you'd like to support me without any additional costs, it would be cool if you use the Audible link in the description. And if you use that link to sign up for a free Audible trial, I get paid a commission, and for you the trial is still free. Since I actually use Audible myself in order to listen to audiobooks, I'm genuinely happy that I finally get to collaborate with them. So check out the link in the description, and now let's continue with the book. Mr. Lofton starts with the objection that Jesus is the head of the Church and not the Pope, and therefore many Orthodox reject it when Catholics give the Pope the title head of the Church. Most Orthodox view the Pope as a first among equals. This objection against Catholicism goes back to the 13th century, so it's certainly nothing new. Mr. Lofton resolves this by explaining that Catholics distinguish between the invisible head of the Church, so Jesus, and the visible head of the Church, so the Pope. Quote, "When disillusioned Catholics begin to discern converting to Eastern Orthodoxy, they are immediately confronted by this claim, and they often find it convincing without thinking it through. I must admit, I was not impressed by this objection when I first heard it. After all, how could Catholics be accused of putting the Pope at the top when every Catholic must confess that Jesus is the head of the Catholic Church? This is evident from numerous scriptural passages, for example, 1 Corinthians 13:3, along with Ephesians 1:22 and 5:23. And is wholeheartedly admitted by Catholics, who hold to these verses as inspired by God. So the question is not whether Jesus is the head of the Church, he is, but whether it's legitimate to make a distinction between an invisible and a visible head of the Church. Before he answers this question, he defines what we mean by church. So the word church can be understood on a local level and on a universal one. The first possible meaning is a group of Christians gathered around a bishop in a particular area. And the term can also refer to all of these groups together who recognize one another in faith, worship, and governance. Then Mr. Lofton goes back and forth with quotations from different theologians on the question whether it's permissible to distinguish between a visible and an invisible head of the Church. The main argument for the Catholic position is that apart from the Pope, there are other scenarios where a visible leader leads people apart from the invisible leadership by Christ. For example, no one would say that there is no need for a bishop because Christ leads the diocese anyways. Mr. Lofton quotes the Orthodox scholar Father John Meyendorff, who essentially held the opinion that the local bishop is a visible manifestation of the invisible God. So in summary, the Catholic and Orthodox approaches to this issue are actually quite similar, because just as the Orthodox don't see a problem in the headship of local bishops, Catholics don't see a problem with the universal headship of the Bishop of Rome. Quoting Mr. Lofton, "The distinction between a visible and an invisible head is afforded to the Orthodox on the local level of a bishop's eparchy, i.e. his diocese. Then the distinction is at least potentially legitimate for Catholics who see the Pope as the head of the universal Church. What is good for the goose is good for the gander." And that final part, by the way, sounds very comical to a non-native speaker, and I wanted to ask you, is that something that also sounds comical for you? Because I really don't know how this is used. Is this formal English, or how does that sound to native ears? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Yeah, back to the book. Another comparison Mr. Lofton makes is that one of the headship of the husband over the wife. Again, no one would argue that this contradicts the headship of Christ over all humans, which includes wives. So by distinguishing between the headship of local bishops and the Pope, the Orthodox contradict themselves to the degree that the Orthodox priest and author Father John Pandelimo Manusakis actually calls these views heretical. The phenomenon of anti-papism, understood as the denial of primus for the universal church, and the elevation of such denial to a trait that allegedly identifies the whole Orthodox Church, is properly speaking heretical. Now I'd like to summarize the chapters that deal with objections against papal infallibility. The first objection I'd like to talk about is that the Eastern churches in the first millennium never accepted papal infallibility. Before answering that objection, Mr. Lofton defines the concept of papal infallibility. Quote, "By papal infallibility, one does not mean that the Pope is impeccable in all his acts. Neither does it mean he is incapable of erring in matters of science. Rather, it simply means that, under certain conditions, his teachings on matters of faith and morals are free from error. Those conditions under which the Pope teaches infallibly are, first, the Pope addresses a matter of faith and morals, second, the Pope defines the doctrine, and third, the Pope binds the whole Church to the teaching." That papal infallibility is, in fact, that limited becomes evident when looking at the number of councils in the Catholic Church. They wouldn't be necessary if the Pope was infallible in everything that he said and thought. Now, regarding the objection that early Eastern Christians did not believe that the Pope was infallible, Mr. Lofton quotes documents that date back to the first millennium, which disprove that objection. One of those quotes is a confession of faith known as the Formula of Hormisdas, I hope I pronounced that correctly, which was signed by the Patriarch of Constantinople and many Eastern bishops. It reads as follows: "The beginning of salvation is to preserve the rule of a correct faith and to deviate in no respect from the constitutions of the fathers. And because the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ cannot be allowed to fail, who said, 'Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church,' etc., Matthew 16:18, these things which were said are proved by the effects of things, because in the Apostolic See, religion has always been preserved without spot or blemish." Mr. Lofton then goes on to answer some objections to that quote. For example, some argue that this formula only makes a statement about the past and doesn't make any future predictions on the preservation of faith of the Apostolic See in the future. The author explains that because this formula is made in the context of the promise in Matthew 16:18, it shows that the faith was preserved because of that promise, and this promise remains to this day. He also quotes many other texts as well, which I'm not going to summarize in this video. Now, another objection regarding papal infallibility, which the author addresses, is the case of Pope Honorius, which some use to disprove papal infallibility. Pope Honorius was condemned by the Sixth Ecumenical Council as a heretic after his death. The statement that caused that condemnation was that the Pope wrote a letter to Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople, where he said that we confess one will of our Lord Jesus Christ, which some interpret to mean that the Pope believed in the later condemned heresy that Christ had only one will. What the Catholic Church actually teaches is that Christ has both a human and a divine will, so he has two wills, which are morally always in harmony. Even if the Pope meant that heresy in that letter, which some dispute by the way, it does not qualify as an ex cathedra teaching, because while the Pope did address a matter of faith and morals, and some argue that he intended to address the whole Church by this response, there is no reason to believe he solemnly defined any doctrine. Thus, this instance fails to meet the criteria of papal infallibility. This demonstrates that the Pope might have made a theological mistake, but that doesn't mean that contradicts papal infallibility, because he didn't teach in an instance where papal infallibility actually applies. Finally, I'd like to touch upon the topic of doctrinal development, which is also discussed in the book, because the topic is important in the context of papal infallibility, in my opinion. Catholics believe that doctrine revealed by God, or doctrine intimately related to revealed doctrine, may develop over time, but it cannot evolve, change, or be corrupted. When understood properly, there is no contradiction between the Orthodox and Catholic views on doctrinal development. To give you an idea of what that proper understanding of doctrinal development is, I'd like to quote a Catholic encyclopedia. "Nothing has been added to or subtracted from the deposit of faith since the death of the last apostle. However, the mysteries revealed by Christ to his apostles are clearer now than they were in the first centuries, through the penetration of these truths by the early fathers and doctors of the Church." Now let's get to my opinion on the book. I actually liked it. Let me tell you why. From a formal perspective, the book follows a very clear structure because, for example, the objections are sorted into 3 categories, so doctrinal attacks, historical attacks, and liturgical attacks, which is something I really liked. The titles are also very clear, so you know exactly what the next chapter is going to be about. The book is also beginner-friendly, I would say, because Mr. Lofton starts off by explaining a bit what led to the schism between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. So even if you as the reader are not that familiar with the topic, you can still read the book. What I also liked is that whenever he used a, how do I call that, complicated word, he always clarified that word in brackets immediately afterwards. So for example, if you're unsure what the word Nestorianism means, you don't need to look it up because an explanation is right there in the book. You might be thinking that that's not worth mentioning, but trust me when I say not all authors do this, and when a book is unclear or poorly structured, you don't want to be reading that. Regarding the arguments themselves, I found some more convincing than others, but the good thing is the author acknowledged the limitations of his own arguments, so at the end of the book, Mr. Lofton writes that there are still objections to the responses he gave in the book, so the discussion could go back and forth a couple more rounds. The book does exactly what it promises to do. It answers orthodoxy, and as such, it's a good source for people who want to get a general overview of the Orthodox objections against Catholicism. But if you are already an expert on that topic, the book might not be ideal for you because each objection is treated on like 10 pages, so the depth you can go into on 10 pages is very limited. But maybe check out the contents of the book, maybe it's interesting for you even if you're an expert on the topic already. In total, the book was a 9 out of 10 for me. That's been it for today. I hope you liked the video. See you next week. God bless and bye!